few days after the Monaco race, General Noriega of Panama, as widely expected, declared the results of the presidential election invalid, prompting President Bush to order 1,900 US troops to the country to protect US assets and citizens, as civil unrest, even civil war, was looking a distinct possibility. The following day, a freight train of the Southern Pacific Railroad, consisting of 6 locomotives and 69 trucks, derailed on a curve in San Bernardino, California, and ploughed into a residential area, demolishing 7 trackside houses on Duffy Street. Miraculously, only 4 people, 2 train crew and 2 residents, were killed in the crash, which a later investigation found was due to an error that saw the train overloaded compared with the braking power of the locomotives. As the cleanup progressed over the next couple of weeks, an underground oil pipeline running alongside the track was also slightly damaged, weakening it. And then on the 25th of May, just after another long freight train had passed the crash site, the pipeline ruptured and exploded, fatally burning 2 more people, destroying 11 more houses and 21 cars, and shooting flames 300 feet into the air. In China, student protests continued, centred on Tiananmen Square in Beijing, though echoed in other cities. In Urumqi, the capital of Xinjiang province, a largely Muslim region populated by Uyghur and Hui people, riots also broke out over a recent book which had made some less than savoury insinuations about the sex lives of Muslims and the phallic nature of Islamic architecture. The offending book was banned and its authors imprisoned, but in Beijing martial law was declared and authorities prepared for a crackdown. In amongst all this, Mikhail Gorbachev visited Beijing and officially ended the Sino-Soviet split that had affected relations between the two nations since 1961. Over in Mexico, meanwhile, the F1 teams were gathering for the start of their 3-race tour of North America. Gerhard Berger was back in the Ferrari cockpit just 5 weeks after his Imola crash, though Gerhard was keen to disclaim that he was still not quite fit, both mentally and physically, much to the chagrin of Nicola Larini, who would have driven the car if Berger had given himself a bit more recovery time. The team had redesigned the airbox a little to try and get a bit more engine power, and a new front wing design as well, as it was thought that that was what had failed at Imola, but it was kind of difficult to be certain because the bent-burned Ferrari had been thoroughly stripped by souvenir hunters by the time it was recovered. Meanwhile, in response to Berger's accident at Imola, FISA had announced that 1990s cars would have to include new safety measures, and the teams were interested to see what that would mean. Elsewhere in the paddock, Minardi had their new car ready, the Nigel Cooperthwaite-designed M189. The untested car was still an unknown quantity, although it had one of the longest wheelbases on the grid, but the striking new paint scheme was turning heads if nothing else. The Benetton team had been hoping to debut their new car too, but a crankshaft problem with the new Ford HB engine meant that they had to persist with the 1988 car. Despite their good showing in Monaco, the cash-strapped Coloni team were only making a token showing in the flyaway races, packing just 1 car and 3 crew, plus the 2 drivers. And both Tyrrell drivers now had an 018 chassis to play with Harvey Postlethwaite pronouncing him satisfied, and Michele Alboreto saying it was really Tyrrell's first race of the season. And so, pre-qualifying kicked off the weekend, with Brabham back on top of the heap, and Raffinell unsurprisingly well adrift at the bottom. Coloni had only brought him along so as not to get fined for non-participation. Alex Caffey was again best of the non-Brabhams, and the Onyxes were next up, improving all the time, with Johansson making it through PQ for the first time and Gachot not far off. As usual, Ayrton Senna dominated qualifying, a full 1.3 seconds ahead of anybody else on Friday, and then knocking over a second off his time on Saturday, to equal Jim Clark's record of 33 career pole positions, with Prost lining up second just under 9/10 behind. Next up was Mansell and a flying Capelli, the new march going very well, with Patrese 5th in race number 180, Berger 6th, Alboreto an excellent 7th in the Tyrrell, and Boutsen again outqualified by his veteran teammate. Stefano Modena was top Brabham and top Pirelli runner, but the team were a bit disappointed with their performance after Monaco, with Brundle back in 20th. Derek Warwick was 10th, but Chiva was still struggling with the car and was back in 24th. The Benettons were also not doing well in 13th and 18th. Nakajima, who actually enjoys Mexico, was 15th ahead of Alio, Tarquini a very creditable 17th in last year's AGS. Johansson would give Onyx their race debut from 21st, Martini qualified the new Minardi 22nd, and the back row of Arnoux and Piquet had 3 world titles and 27 race wins between them. Moreno failed to set a time at all and didn't qualify, joining Dalmas, Gugelmin and Sala, both of the latter having had ongoing car troubles. But it was also worth noting that the 24 non-McLaren cars were all covered by just over 2.5 seconds. Jonathan Palmer had had an off on Saturday morning in the new Tyrrell and explained what had happened to the BBC.
And came unstuck when the back hit the ground pretty heavily on the bump through the quick corner. Of course, that threw it into a big spin. The damage wasn't too bad, but it was enough to put me out for virtually all of the remainder of that first practice session on the Saturday morning. We got out a bit late for Saturday afternoon, and the car was in understeering, and it took a bit of a while to sort it out. So the ultimate qualifying position of 14th was a bit disappointing.
But was absolutely fine and able to race. The heat and abrasive surface of the Mexico City circuit meant that tyres were of vital importance, and while Pirelli were clearly making good qualifying tyres, their race rubber was still suspect. And there was also the choice of compound to take into consideration, hard-wearing but slower B compounds that might go the race, or softer, faster C compounds that would need changing. A difficult call, and within the McLaren teams the drivers made different choices, with Senna going with Bs on the left and Cs on the right, and Prost Cs all round. So, on a traditional blazing hot Mexico City afternoon, the cars lined up for the start, with the pundits pointing out that, as usual in Mexico, the pole position was on the dirty side of the track, which could hand Prost a slight advantage. In the event, though, Senna got away well, but not as well as Mansell, who leapt out from behind Ayrton and inserted himself in front of Prost. By the time they went into turn 1, Berger had also got up into third, while Nakajima got tangled up with De Cesaris somewhere in the midfield and ended up in a gravel trap. As they came through the infield section, Prost had got back ahead of Berger, while Senna was already opening out a gap to Mansell as he swept round Peraltada to finish the lap. But further back, Modena spun at the famously tricky last corner, was clouted by Guillard in an unseen accident that Caffey spun avoiding, but recovered. Prost got ahead of Mansell on the start-finish straight, but despite Modena's car being about half a mile from the track, the race was red-flagged anyway, and the field was brought to a halt in the Peraltada before completing lap 2. So the mechanics all jogged over and wheeled the cars in the first start and would have to start from the pit lane using Gugelmin's 891 chassis. Why he was starting from the pit lane when the other three were able to retake the grid slots was no doubt a question March would be asking, but the organisers wouldn't budge. Senna got away fastest again in the restart, with Prost squeezing out Mansell this time to hold on to second, and indeed Berger then sneaked up ahead of Mansell too, so it was McLaren, Ferrari, Williams, Patrese and Williams, Boutsen as they went into turn 1, with Alboreto, Warwick, Nannini, De Cesaris, Modena and Guillard following them through the Moises-Solana complex. At the end of lap 1, the McLarens already held a decent lead, while Capelli trailed in at the end of the next lap with a transmission failure, a real shame after a great qualifying performance. It was still 2x2 up front, with 3 inter-team battles as Mansell got past Berger and Boutsen harried Patrese and Prost harried Senna. But the Brazilian was soon pulling out again, while Palmer dropped out with a broken throttle linkage. Before long, Prost had Mansell on his rear wing, and Derek Warwick in 9th was being hassled by a fired-up Tarquini in the AGS. Boutsen dropped out after 15 laps with an electrical failure, and then a lap later both Berger and Johansson also retired, Gerhard with another gearbox failure and Stefan with a broken transmission. Gerhard probably wouldn't be too upset given his physical condition. By lap 19, Senna was cruising through the back markers and Prost peeled into the pits, deciding to switch to harder B compounds on his left side, where his Cs were already pretty badly blistered. The McLaren team made a bit of a bish of the stop. He was stationary a full 15 seconds and returned to the track 5th. So it was now Senna leading Mansell, Patrese, Alboreto and Prost, with Nannini 6th, chased by Warwick and Tarquini, with Guillard 9th. Behind them, Piquet had also been slowly working his way up through the field and was now 14th behind Caffey. 1987 winner Mansell, meanwhile, was now charging, getting the gap to Senna down to under 8 seconds and leading Patrese now by over 21.5. Prost had set fastest lap as he also sought to make up for his pit stop. It was approaching half distance, and whatever Alain had done he would now have to do all over again because the McLaren team had put the wrong tyres on his car, replacing his blistered Cs with more Cs, not the Bs he'd asked for, so back he came in for another Keystone Cop stop, getting out just ahead of Senna, who was now coming round to lap him. Warwick and Nakajima retired together, electrics for Derek and a spin for Satoru, as Senna breezed past Prost with no problem, which seemed to confirm to some the theory that Ayrton's engines always seemed to contain more horses than Alain's. Senna had responded to Mansell's charge and drew away again, and Mansell's gearbox responded in turn by emitting a plume of smoke and seizing up. Nigel parked up next to his old ride Boutsen's car and went golfing. Prost's tyres had warmed up by now though, and he was staying with Senna, and moved up to 5th as both McLarens passed Tarquini. Prix was now in a solid, if somewhat lonely, second place, some 39 seconds behind Senna, while Johnny Herbert, suffering in the unaccustomed heat and also lacking the strength in his legs to properly depress the brake pedal, made the second stop of a rather anonymous race of his own. After some inconclusive communication, he headed back out. Alboreto was just a few seconds behind his countryman Prix and charging in the new Tyrrell 018, which he seemed to be thoroughly enjoying. Ken Tyrrell, meanwhile, would no doubt be glad of the great TV coverage and hoping that his cars wouldn't be plain sponsor-free blue for much longer. Senna eventually backed off and let Prost unlap himself with 8 laps to go, point made, and with Prost looking like he'd blistered his tyres again. Prix took notice of Alboreto's charge and upped the pace a bit to compensate, and that was pretty much it for action, as Senna cruised to another completely dominant win, 15 seconds ahead of Prix at the flag, with Alboreto taking Tyrrell's first podium finish since Detroit 1983, when Michele took the team's last win. Nannini took 4th, Prost trailed in 5th, and the last man on the lead lap, with Tarquini taking the last point, his first and the second for AGS, and hoping after the false alarm of Imola that he'd get to keep them this time. And out of the 6-point scorers, only Senna and Prost weren't Italian, but you suspect most Italians would have traded all 4 of them for a good finish in a Ferrari. Eddie Cheever had driven a quietly barnstorming race to finish 7th from 24th on the grid, leading home Guiar and the Brabhams, with Herbert trailing in last and 3 laps down, but just finishing in the circumstances was something of an achievement in itself. Ron Dennis publicly apologised to Prost afterwards for the pit stop cock-ups, but it would only add fuel to the rumours that McLaren were now favouring Senna. Prost had been asked before the race about his future and announced that he would say within the next 2 weeks whether or not he would be driving for McLaren in 1990, which was probably not what Ron wanted to hear. Meanwhile, the Grand Prix circus loaded back into its trucks ready for the 28-hour journey north to Eddie Cheever's hometown, Phoenix, Arizona, and a new circuit.